This and all talks at the 2019 JavaScript for WordPress Conference are brought to you in part by our sponsors Pantheon, a high-performance hosting platform with agile developer tools. Check them out at pantheon.io.
Hi everyone, welcome to the JavaScript for WordPress Conference. If you can hear me, please say hi and tell us where you're watching from. This is the third track for this conference, and we have Adam Silverstein. Did I pronounce that right? He's going to be talking to us about JavaScript hooks in WordPress. Hi, yeah. I see the eyes popping in. Okay, so just in case if you haven't seen my face here before, I switched with Fabian. He's assisting the other speaker. So I'm going to be your host for the next 1 hour. All right, so I'm going to put Adam on, and then he can introduce himself, and then we can start.
Hey, everyone. Hope you can see my screen, or you will be able to in a minute. I'm Adam Silverstein. I'm a lead open source engineer at 10up. And I have been kind of championing this WP Hooks library for a while, so I'm going to talk about it again. I talked about it last year, so we're going to see kind of what's happened in the last year. Yeah, that's me. All right, so we're going to jump into JavaScript Hooks for WordPress. We're talking about WP Hooks library here. That's getting a lot of use in Gutenberg, and I'm going to be talking about how it's used in Gutenberg, how it's evolved in the last year, and also kind of how you might think about using it in your own plugins, some kind of caveats, issues with that. And it's going to be, I have a lot of slides prepared, but it's going to be a little bit of rambling style presentation. We're going to go look at some GitHub tickets, look at some code, look at some examples. So I hope to get through at least a half an hour of talking here and have a little bit of time at the end for questions. So a little bit of background about hooks. And of course, we're not talking about React hooks here, just to clarify. They're related only by name. Unfortunately, they're both called hooks, but they have no relationship to each other. This is more like the PHP hooks that we're familiar with as WordPress developers. So add action, do action, add filter, apply filters. These are things that as WordPress developers, we are very familiar with. It's how we've extended WordPress for many years. There are almost 3,000 instances of apply filters in WordPress core and over 1,000 do actions. And this is basically how we have added extensibility into WordPress. The WP hooks, the JavaScript version of hooks was proposed long ago, back in 2012. And it was proposed originally by Daryl Coopersmith on this fun ticket. I'll just open it just because I like looking at these old tickets. And if you don't know Daryl Coopersmith, he was the one who created the media library that we still have with us to this day in WordPress core. And this ticket, even though it was opened back in 2012, really took a lot of twists and turns, a lot of different ideas about how we should be implementing this. Kind of one library that rose to the top that was Carl Danley's library. And that's what I sort of have been championing, that library. And that's what we wound up using in Gutenberg. And we actually, whoops, go back. We actually published it as an NPM package, which is super exciting. It means that you can use hooks standalone in your own project. You just install them to add them to your project. And then you can literally create your own hooks object. So that means you can use hooks internally in your own plugin, in your own namespace without exposing them at all. And of course, we're exposing hooks in core as WP hooks. So you can also use the global WP hooks that we're exposing inside WordPress. But the fact that it's available as an NPM package means that you can also use it in your own plugin. You don't have to be in WordPress at all. You don't have to use the WP hooks global at all. And that was back in 2017. So now we're getting on 2 years since we've had it out there in the wild, that it's been used and kind of proven, and also has gotten a lot of improvements along the way that I'm going to talk about. But basically, what we're aiming for here is feature parity. We are trying to have the JavaScript package behave very much like the PHP package. So, if you look at these functions, these should be very familiar to you as coming from the PHP world. It basically mirrors the entire API that we had available in PHP. If you are astute observer here, you will notice that there is one really big difference, which is that we require a namespace parameter. This is not part of the PHP hooks. And it is added so that you can remove the hooks and or also find them if you're trying to see if a hook has been added. And the reason for this is that in JavaScript, it's very, very common to use anonymous callback functions. It's pretty much the regular how we do callbacks. Name functions are kind of almost a new thing now. But when you have an anonymous function, you can't easily remove that function, that hook, right? So if you don't have a name to unhook, we wouldn't be able to do things like remove action and remove filter, which for extensibility purposes turn out to be really important. When you have a plugin that adds a lot of filters, it's very common to want to remove a single filter that maybe you don't want that happening in your case. So this is we decided was a critical feature, and right now we're actually sort of facing this in our PHP hooks world because we're trying to update our coding standards to allow people to use anonymous functions. But that creates an issue for hooks where we'll no longer be able to remove hooks if people use anonymous functions, because there's no easy way to grab a handle on an anonymous function. There are some complicated ways, but no easy ways. So yeah, these optimizations all happened in the last year, and I find these really fascinating. So just to look at them really quickly, this was a micro optimization that Andrew Duthie did. In addition to adding benchmarking into the hooks library, what he discovered was that because of the kind of core use of with filters inside of Gutenberg, which we're going to get to in a little bit, hooks were being added like 3,000 times on load. Now, of course, he created a very large document to test this, kind of an edge case, but maybe not that uncommon. It has 20,000 words with 500 paragraphs in the document, but that's a very significant number of times, and it wound up adding up to, I don't know how many milliseconds. He gave the exact number of milliseconds, but maybe like half a second or close to a second to run that. And the optimization here in the code was actually really tiny. What the optimization does here is when we're appending new hooks on to the end of the kind of hooks array that we're tracking internally, instead of just using an append operation, we actually, since we know the exact index, we just assign it to that index, and it turns out that's much faster of an operation. And it turns out that that's mostly what you're doing, is you're just adding one on to the end. That's like the primary case. So this optimization was a micro optimization, but it actually made hooks operate like 20 to 180 times faster. So very significant performance increase for adding hooks. Another optimization here was how filters are added and bound. And then another thing that we added, which I think was really cool, was we added the all hook, which is a feature of the PHP hook library that allows you to track all hooks that have been added. So it's really about debugging. It's a debugging feature that I hope to see added to debugging tools that we have, but it's a way that you can quickly tell what hooks have been added across, at the current time. And what's interesting about this is that the code was added behind a build conditional, which means that it will only run in the production environment. And what that means in this context is that in WordPress, when you have the script debug enabled and you're running the non-minified JavaScript files, this feature will be available. But if you're running the production minified versions of JavaScript, this function will not be available because of the overhead introduced by having this check for the all hook. So just some cool optimizations that have happened in the last year, and this has come out of our use of this in Gutenberg and kind of battle testing it. So I think it's super cool to see these small changes happening on a well-established library. It's been around for many years, but now that we're actually using it in production, we're finding ways to improve it and adjust it. All right, so, oh good, my timing is right about on. I'm 10 minutes in. I'm just gonna take a little sip of water. All right, I'm gonna talk about how we are using hooks in Gutenberg. and a little bit beyond how it's being used in some plugins. I know there's another talk about that today, so I won't go too far into it. I think probably the biggest kind of most powerful filtering that we're using inside Gutenberg are the block filters. And there are a number of block filters. We're going to talk about some of them. And I'll have, by the way, the slides and all the links posted, obviously, at the end, so you'll be able to go check all these things out yourself. But some of these are very, very powerful. We apply filters to saving. We apply filters when blocks are registered. We apply filters to the edit mode. So this is a super powerful way to basically add functionality to any block on the screen, because all blocks are run through a filter. It enables you to add functionality to those blocks. And there's literally code here that you can just paste into your browser. So I love the fact that these code samples will actually work in your browser. Oh, if you have your browser up and running. Let me see. Why isn't that running? I'll get that started in the background. But anyway, you can just paste these right into your editor and actually see them work, which is super cool. Most of these examples that are given in the block documentation here, you can literally just paste into the JavaScript console and see the results of them live. So in a second, I'll do that for you as soon as my local development environment comes up. The with filters higher order component is kind of the underlying magic of most of the filtering that happens on blocks. And with filters is actually a component that you can use in your own plugin as well. So what with filters is it's a higher order component, which just means it's a function that takes a component and returns a new component. But when you wrap a component with filters, what that does is it applies a filter to that component. So it allows you to replace the component with a new component, or append some new information after the component or before the component, or change properties that are passed to the component. So it has a lot of different kind of features that it enables as soon as you turn it on. So let's just look at it really quickly. We're going to just see the documentation for it. And this is just a great example of how it works. This is the component that's going to be filtered. The with filters call is applied to it with this hook name, my hook name, and then we pass the original component. What this add filters call does is it's going to add a filter onto my hook name and call this function with component appended. And with component appended, what that's going to do is take the filtered component, that's the original component. It's going to return that along with a new component appended to the end of it. So this is basically just like you'd think of a normal filter, where we're adding some information to the end of the filter, but in this case, we're actually adding an additional React component. So this is super powerful. You can use with filters in your own plugin because it's part of the component package. So I'll show that a little example later of how I've used that in plugins. I think my local dev environment should be up here. I wanted to go back just really quickly to this example. I just love this example here where you're adding a red color to the background of all blocks on the page. So I'm just going to go to a post just because live demos are the best. And then just in the JavaScript, just in the console here, I'm dropping that code in that I pasted. And what this does is it's going to add this background color when I save the post. So it's on save is where it's adding it. And if I refresh now, should get this lovely red background color on all my blocks. Yes, that worked. So that's just by adding a filter, but I'm going to get into the power of that a little bit later. It doesn't have to be this simple. It's just a simple example to show you how this works inside Gutenberg. So with filters, again, is kind of the magical higher order component that we have in Gutenberg, but you can also use it yourself. And it's kind of like the special sauce. So I wanted to dive into a couple of examples of how this works in Gutenberg. And I think this post-featured image one is a really good example because it's very simple to see how it's working. So this is the post-featured image component. Let me go back into the editor really quickly and show you what I'm talking about. So in this case, we're talking about this little thing here, the featured image block, right? So what this is the component that drives that, and what we see here is after defining the entire functional component, at the very end, when it's exported, it gets exported with filters applied to it, which makes that component filterable, meaning the component itself is going to be run through apply filters with this filter name, editor.postFeaturedImage. And then this kind of shows you how you can use that, right? So now that you have a filtered thing, you have a couple options. You can replace that entirely by basically adding the filter and returning a brand new component. In this case, it's just being created on the fly here. Or you can append something above or below the original component. Again, we're just calling the filter, and then we're returning the original component, but with something above it and something below it. So again, super cool. I'm just going to demonstrate these right in the browser. I'll copy this over. One really magical thing about with filters is that it applies dynamically. So it will apply like as soon as I add this change, it's going to apply. So watch this featured image block, and this is the one that's going to append and prepend. And as soon as I add those, boom, there they are, append and prepend. So this is basically allowing us to put new content right into Gutenberg on the fly using this sort of pluggable filtered area. And here's another example where we're just going to replace the entire area with our own component with this replacement string, basically. And if I run that here, this filter will run later. So it will actually replace the entire content of the panel. So it's a pretty neat way to make an area of your plugin kind of pluggable. It's a visual pluggable area through the power of the with filters. I talked a little bit about the block filters. Sorry, my screen keeps hopping around because my mouse does that. But I just want to look at these again really quickly. You've got, like I mentioned, you've got the one for the edit. You've got one when blocks are registered, so you can change, for example, what blocks support. And of course, as you do this, you can apply this conditionally, right? The filter is going to be applied to every block, but if you only want to apply your changes to a specific block type, you can limit that right here at the beginning of your callback. Extra props, so you can pass extra props through, saving, the class name, all these things are filterable inside blocks. So blocks themselves are super extensible. So that means you can take core blocks and add features to them, theoretically remove features. You can add sidebar things that appear. So there's really a lot of power in being able to take those original elements and run them through filters. And of course, blocks being the sort of core component of Gutenberg, like the fact that they're filterable really means it's super powerful what you can do. I don't think we've even scratched the surface of what's possible. This is an interesting one, the media upload component. This component is literally just an empty component. It's basically designed to accept fills from other places using the with filters. So it's just a stub, essentially, so that we can add in the media library in different places in Gutenberg, the media upload button, essentially. All right, let's keep moving on. Editor filters. So there are a bunch of filters in here, and I just wanted to touch on a few of them. This one is pretty limited what's in here right now, but the idea here is that these would be filters that are specific to the editor itself. So this is like the image size filter. There's an interstitial markup for that's what you see before previews are generated. And I think there's room for additional filters. So part of what I keep asking people is like, what are you having trouble extending in Gutenberg? And there are a couple different approaches to extensibility. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but filters is definitely one of them. Yeah. So let's talk about a couple more that are in there. The autocomplete filters. So this is, these are what happens when you're in Gutenberg and you start typing something in a red block. Can I make another block here? Yeah, I'm just going to make a new post. If you type the @ symbol and start typing someone's name, you get this little pop-up. That is an autocompleter, and Gutenberg allows you to add your own autocompleters. You simply add them with this filter. Pretty cool that you can add autocompleters right into the editor. And they're actually not that difficult because of the API. I'm not going to get into them. Another thing that we're using hooks for in Gutenberg is for a global heartbeat event bus. So previously in WordPress core, heartbeat, when it fired, it would trigger actions on using jQuery. jQuery document trigger, and then you could pass data through that back and forth. What we're doing now is these have been transformed into kind of do actions. So we are now trying to get away from using jQuery ultimately. And what this enables us to do is kind of create a global event bus similar to how we had with jQuery, document on. Now we're doing these all with do action. So it's the same concept, but sort of taken into a little bit more of a modern context, and also giving us the ability to move away from jQuery. So now I'm going to just talk about a couple of examples of using these filters. So this is one that I'm working on. It's a very experimental, currently the version, but definitely does work to some degree, and it's a block-based revision. So as you add and remove things, you can go in and view those changes. And what it's doing here is adding these classes using the filters to show what has been added and what has been removed. This is another one that Ryan Welcher worked on internally at 10up for a client. This is not open source, but is probably something that you could build. So the idea here is an editorial commenting system with approvals. And you can see here that this is block based. So for each block, as you click through blocks, you get this nice box on the right-hand side where editors can leave comments. And then, those can be approved by another editor, and you can't publish the post until all the comments have been approved. But this is using filters again. So it's a filter attached to the block. Whenever the block is loaded, then that data is available and is displayed in the sidebar. It's added as a filter on the block. Recently launched Google SiteKit, which was a really fun project to work on. And internally on SiteKit, I'm going to show you a little bit how we do this, but we have a UI here that's built of these kind of fillable areas. So this is very much like I was talking about before, where you can see data here coming in from Search Console and from analytics. And these are very separate sources with different APIs. And the way this is combined visually here is using a fillable with filters. It's actually using the with filters library. So here is the source code for what we are using to fill in a component into the filtered area, the component that has with filters applied to it. And these are open source now, so I have the links here so you can actually go look at them. But this is, again, it's a really simple function. It's going to take in the new component. We also offer the ability to pass new props through. And it basically returns a new component, and we pass the original component through because in our project we need to know what the original component was that was filtered sometimes. But this basically is going to return an entirely new component replacing the filtered component. And then we have this helper function create add to filter that's used to append to a filtered area. And again, you pass it you pass it your new component, and it's going to take and create a new an element where you've got the original component and the new component. And so these helper functions are just used throughout. So you don't, once you've kind of have these helper functions, fill, filter with component, create, add to filter, those basically allow you to use that filtered area just with like wrapping your component in a call. So now we're getting on to kind of the last part, which I think my timing is good here. I'm going to talk a little bit about some considerations for using hooks, some pros and cons, some things you might want to consider. Yeah, I will, Jeremy, post my slides after this is done. And I'll put a link somewhere. I'm sure Zach will be sharing out slides and stuff. I want to talk about slot fill a little bit. Ryan Welcher is going to be giving a talk specifically on slot fill later today, so definitely watch that. Slot fill is the other major way that we provide extensibility in Gutenberg right now, or one of the other ways that we provide it. And basically what slot fill does is it's very similar to what I've been describing with filters and then appending into that filter. So you can think of slot fill as you create a slot somewhere on in your UI. It's an area that can be filled, and then anywhere that users that plugins add fills, those appear in the slot. So for example, we added one recently to the sidebar so that you can add additional sidebar components using a fill. So you create a fill and it's a component and it just drops right in there. You can create many fills, they all go in there. And I think slot fill has some advantages and disadvantages, and I'm going to kind of talk about them and why we're using one or the other, or why you might choose to use one or the other, and what the use cases are. So I feel like there was another page here that I lost, but I'm just gonna talk about this one because I thought I had another page on this. But basically, slot fill has some really distinct advantages. It allows you to add filters anywhere at any time. The fills are part of the React tree, which is different than how hooks work. When you add something in with hooks, it's more like a portal. It's more like you have separate React trees and you're mixing them together. I think fills are really easy to use once you understand them. You just create a fill with a name and it just automatically appears in there. I think hooks have a little harder barrier to actually using them in React applications. Some cons for fills is I don't think there's a way to remove fills once you've added them, although Ryan might correct me. Currently, there's no priority given to fills, so they are displayed in the order that you add them. If you add the fills in a specific order, that's the order that they will appear in. With filters, with WP hooks, we do have priority, so you can set one to priority 10 and one to priority 11, and you know that they will appear in that order. I think the ability to remove hooks that have been added is super powerful, because you may, like a really common example is a plugin that provides a whole bunch of features and you want to unhook some of those features. That's something that you can't really do with slot fill. I think one big advantage with hooks is and possibly disadvantage, is the familiarity to us as WordPress developers. As a community, we've gotten really used to this idea of creating filters in different places to make our own plugins extensible, and then also leveraging WordPress core's many filters to extend WordPress. So I think it is very familiar, and that's very comforting. That also potentially has some pitfalls to it, which I'm going to talk about in the closing part of my talk. I think possibly easier to debug filters, although I don't know. Debugging these things can be difficult because you're mashing different elements from different places together. So it can be, for example, if you have a bug in something that's being inserted by a filter or a fill, it may not be immediately obvious from the error messages that it's coming from this other place. So debugging can be tricky. I think with filters, with the all hook and some of the other kind of familiarity, it maybe is a little easier to debug because you can search for the strings, for example. I guess you can do that with fills too, but they are a little different in that way. And I think a con for filters is what I mentioned before, which is that they act like portals. They're essentially separate React trees, so you can't easily do things like pass context down through filters. That is something you can address with props, but it is a kind of a shortfall. All right, I'm going to go to the next page here and talk about a couple other things. So using and I think I want to talk about the pitfalls a little bit more, but I'll get to that somehow if I lost a slide. So using the plugin in your theme, you kind of have two choices. You can, like I said, you can use WP Hooks as the global namespace, wp.hooks. And if you're developing for Gutenberg, you can be sure that that's going to be loaded. If you're developing a plugin that works across all of WP admin, it's a little bit different. You need to make sure that you have WP Hooks enqueued, which is a library that's available in core since WordPress 5.0. If your plugin needs to work before WordPress 5.0, you'll need to build that and bundle it with your plugin. So the Google Sitekit plugin is a good example of that. Since we support all the way back to WordPress 4.7, you'll see code that builds and bundles all of the WordPress dependencies. And if we're on WordPress before 5.0, we have to include those dependencies. Past 5.0, those are all bundled, or if the Gutenberg plugin is available. So some kind of tricky parts about how you're using it. If you're trying to use the global namespace, so you need to make sure it's available. And then the other thing is you could use it internally, right? So if you want to, for example, have filterable areas inside your plugin that other parts of your plugin can access, but you don't want to expose that to the rest of the world, you can just use you build it inside your kind of closure of your plugin. So you just import the hooks package, you create your own hooks object to work off of. And you can use with filters, right? So with filters is available as a component. You pull it in from NPM. I think it's in the components, WP components, but I'll find the exact link later. And then you can just use it right in your project, right? And it has some awesome features. One of the really cool things that I sort of skipped over on with filters is that it looks for the adding and removal of hooks that match the hook name, and then re-renders the React component. So what that means is that you can add a hook even after a block has been created and added and displayed. You can add a hook later and it will re-render that block automatically without any intervention on your part. Or if you remove a hook that on a filtered block, similarly, it will re-render. So everything is kept up to date. That is a potential pitfall of hooks just in general, of JavaScript hooks compared to PHP hooks. And that you don't know, because of the way JavaScript loads, you don't know when something has been loaded, right? So if you're going to add a hook for something, it's very tricky. Thanks for the link, Greg. It's very tricky because you need to make sure that your hook is in place before you do the apply filters, right? The add filter needs to be in place before the apply filters, or you need to account for that like we did with filters, where we watch for the hooks and then re-render. There are some kind of workarounds to this, but it is a problem. And one other thing that I think is kind of a pitfall that this brings up is the way that we use do action in PHP is we have like these do action triggers that happen, for example, during HTML rendering. And as developers, we hook in and then we render out our own HTML at that point. That does not work at all in JavaScript because by the time you catch the do action, it's not happening during rendering. That's not how we render anyway. The filtering is the way you can change rendering. Where we are using do action is to indicate events that have happened. So for example, firing an action when setup is complete, when your plugin has completely loaded, firing some action so that other plugins can respond, or when some async event completes, right? So you want to enable people to respond when the thing has been saved and do something. So that would be a good example of when you could fire a do action and people would listen for that. Filtering, I kind of jumped down, but this example, filtering default values, is a good example of how I think you can use filters, and I'm going to show one example of that later. But basically, you have some settings or default values in your plugin, and you want people to be able to alter those. You just run them through a filter, apply filters, get the values. As long as the filter has been added before you apply the filters, that change will take effect. and it has works just like people are used to using things in PHP. So it has that nice advantage. You can also use it for global state, like I talked about with Heartbeat. But I think like a pitfall of it. Where is my pitfall slide? A pitfall of it is just like, I think Hooks has the tendency to let us think kind of in the old way. So like the observer pattern is a really good example of this. The way that we did things in the past with Backbone and the media library, there's a lot of setting up listeners where you're listening for events, and then other things that are triggering events. And when that happens, you respond to the events. And so this whole kind of spaghetti code of things that are listening for other things, that is not how we build things in React these days. React is very much built on the idea of the components responding directly to the state. And so I think that Hooks kind of puts us back in this old paradigm of like, I'm going to trigger something, I'm going to listen for something, and we don't really want to be thinking that way in React. So I think that that's a pitfall of it. It gives us a tendency to kind of think in an older way. It doesn't have to be used that way, but it certainly can be thought of that way. This is my example for the filters. So we built this little plugin that will open source shortly. That's a character picker for Gutenberg. And you can see that I'm using an NPM package that provides a character map that has probably about 1,000 characters, which is way too many for most use cases. So I think a nice thing here would be a filter on that list of characters so that plugins could provide their own list, or just boil that down to maybe one of those tabs. And it'd be a very straightforward thing to add a filter that did that. Yeah, so when not to use hooks, right? So I talked about this a little bit, but we're not going to use hooks for state management, like a global filter that everything passes some data through. Don't do that. Use WP data, which is more sort of like a Redux-like system for state management. Don't think in the old way. Remember that reactive apps are different than old style JavaScript apps, and don't let hooks fool you into thinking you can build things the old way in the new system. Oh yeah, here we are. Don't filter values that belong in state. You can't use actions for rendering. Don't use the observer pattern. You can use it, but it doesn't really fit into modern paradigms, and you're going to run into a lot of problems later if you take that approach. So here's an example of me thinking the old way and then learning from the Gutenberg team that there's a new way of doing things. So this is my original pull request. I wanted to figure out a way to prevent posts from being saved in Gutenberg. I wanted to, as developers, for us to be able to lock saving. So my original proposal was, hey, let's put a filter on isEdit post savable, which is a selector. And basically, if that's filterable, then plugins can just add a filter and they can return false. And then later they can return true, and that will determine whether or not, everywhere in the app where we call that function, whether or not posts are savable. And this actually works. It's not that it doesn't work, it's that it's not the best approach. So the approach that we wound up with is much more Redux-like. It's basically dispatching of actions. So if you haven't used Redux, that sounds like gobbledygook, I'm sure. But just in terms of the API, so that you understand how it works, what we do is we call wp.data.dispatch core editor lock post saving. So there's a new function that's exposed called lock post saving, and we pass a name. That's our namespace for our lock. So many different plugins can pass their locks in. We keep track of all those locks internally in state. And then when you want to remove the lock, there's a new function, unlock post saving. And again, passing it the name that you've given your lock. So until all locks have been removed, post saving is disabled. This works very differently than the filter approach, right? It has the same result, but it's a very different API if you think about it. Now we've exposed a very explicit method that people can call. It's an action that they're dispatching, but just think of it as a function that they're calling. And that enables them to set the lock or remove the lock. And it's a more explicit API than just having a filter with a certain name that you have to use. So I think in certain cases, we might immediately think, oh, a filter would be good for this. But if you think a little more deeply about it, maybe there's a better API that's more succinct, that's easier to understand, that's more scalable. So there's definitely some places where you could use filters, but maybe something else is going to be a better choice architecturally. And certainly working on the Gutenberg project, you learn about stuff like that. So I think this was a good example of kind of where filters could work, but maybe aren't the best choice, where WP Hooks is not the best choice. So that's it for me. That kind of wraps up my time. I got about, I don't know, 9 or 10 minutes left.
Yeah, okay,
Good
great.
point.
So we have 3 questions. It's in the question and answer section. It's in a ask a question tab on your screen. But if you can't see it, let me read the first question from Meryl. She said, after adding content to post image with filters, how do you pull them into the front end?
So the filter, how do you pull it in the front end? So I guess it depends on what you're storing in there, what you're doing in there. So what that was about for the featured image was just replacing the UI or adjusting the UI for the admin side. It doesn't really address how you're going to render that on the front end. But for example, you could add a checkbox underneath a featured image that was like wrap in a frame. And if you check that, then on the front end, you would render a frame around the image. I don't know. I just came up with that example, but that's up to you as the developer. You would have to write that front end code. You would use the filter to add the checkbox in the admin and perhaps add the handling code to store that information. And then on the front end, you would have to look for that information and handle it on your own.
Okay. Meryl, does that answer your question? Let us know in the comments. Also, there's another one by Ryan Smith. He said, this may be off topic, but is there a way of reordering items in the sidebar using filters? Kind of like what you do with meta boxes before.
Yeah, there is no way currently, as far as I know, to reorder those items. As far as I know that like for the ones that you're adding currently using the new slot fill that was just added to Gutenberg, there's no way to order them because slot fill just fills in stuff in the order that it's added. But there is an open PR that adds priority to slot fill that would enable us to have an order at least to the things that we added. I don't think there's a way currently to reorder the default built-in ones.
Okay, great. I'll take the last question, and then I think we have more in the chat section, but let me take this last one from Wingy. It says, can you use Gutenberg blocks/hooks in a separate, not WordPress, React admin application that allows users, such as in a marketplace, in quotes, to add or edit WordPress content using the WordPress API? If so, what tools do you use for this?
That's a long question. The short answer is yes, you definitely can use hooks outside of WordPress. In terms of adding and editing content using the WordPress API, that's a much bigger question. I don't really know how to answer that. You could use Gutenberg, I guess, anywhere, right? Gutenberg is designed to be run outside of the WordPress context. But if you, let's say, built a standalone app or a mobile app or something that you could use filters internally and then talk to the REST APIs using, I don't know, WP data. So there's a lot there to unpack for sure.
Okay. I hope that helps, Wingy. So you have one in the chat section from Paul. It says, could you use autocomplete in the shortcode block to autocomplete or validate the shortcode?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Autocomplete is available anywhere to validate the shortcode had been typed. I'm not really sure, Paul. I mean, the autocomplete is available anywhere that you have the rich text component. So I think it's built into the rich text component. But I don't really know how that relates to shortcodes and if you could use it to generate or alter shortcodes in any way. I don't really know. I see a question from P about taxonomy. There is a filter for the taxonomy selector. I don't remember the name of it offhand, but I can find that and give it to you in the Slack chat. But there is one where you can alter the taxonomy selector.
So we have another one that they ask a question widget. It says, how would you add hooks functionality in pre-WP 5.0?
How would you add the hooks functionality before WordPress 5.0? So kind of two ways. Either you're doing npm install and bringing the hooks package into your JavaScript bundle, so it's just part of your JavaScript bundle, and then you can just use it internally. Or if you want to load it like a normal JavaScript separate library, you can actually build hooks from the npm package using Webpack, and then spit that out as like a hooks.js file that you load. And you can actually see an example of that in the SiteKit, Google SiteKit project. It is quite complicated, the Webpack configuration that's needed to do that, because Webpack needs to understand how to build those as external WP globals. But you can also look at the Gutenberg project. There may be something built into scripts that does it. I don't know. But yes, what you would need to do is either bundle it in your JavaScript or build separately a hooks JavaScript that you bundled with your plugin and loaded in the pre 5.0 context. If it's not available, right? Because if Gutenberg's installed, then it is available in 4.9. Thanks everyone for joining the talk, and thanks to 10up for having me work on open source.